Thank you for this invitation. So yeah, just briefly again, my name is Veronika Lubert. I'm a doctoral research fellow in psychology, and I'm working together with sports psychologist Peter Grüppel at the University of Vienna. And today I will talk about our research on psychological interventions for managing performance anxiety under pressure in the performing arts. And thereby I'll also introduce my dissertation projects to you. Pursuing a career in the performing arts means not only a lot of practice, but also many situations in which one has to show one's optimal performance. Sometimes when the stakes are high, it might happen that even though a musician, dancer, or actress is highly skilled and motivated, they experience a significant decline in their performance. And this phenomenon is well known in the performing arts, but also among athletes. And in sports, it is called choking under pressure. The choking theory assumes that pressure can lead to performance anxiety, which in turn affects the attentional focus. So this means that the performer experiences increased self-focus or explicit monitoring of the performance, which interferes with the automatic execution of the task and interrupts its well-learned processes. Or the performer might get distracted by task-irrelevant thoughts or worries. And both of these attentional shifts are considered maladaptive and can have a detrimental effect on performance. Many ways have been proposed to help performers in pressure situations. In dance and acting, there is generally a lack of interventions for performance under pressure. When looking back at previous research in music performance, many interventions for the enhancement of performance in high pressure situations are actually aimed at preventing or reducing the experience of performance anxiety in the long term. For example, through cognitive behavioral therapy or extensive mental skills programs. So, but what if anxiety is already heightened in a given moment? For example, before an important audition? Well, sports psychologists have developed ad hoc theory-matched choking interventions to manage heightened anxiety with the aim to facilitate optimal attentional control for performance under pressure. And such interventions that specifically aim to prevent explicit monitoring or distraction have been successfully used with athletes across different disciplines. Several principles of performance enhancement in sports are also applicable for dancers, actors, and musicians. So we are interested in ways of transferring these interventions that have been shown to be beneficial for athletes to the performing arts. And as reviews also showed several methodological weaknesses of existing studies in the performing arts, such as the lack of a control group or no actual pressure situation, I'm not only addressing this research gap with my dissertation, but I'm also aiming to improve the implied methodology. So the overall goal of my dissertation is to transfer the knowledge from sports psychology into the area of the performing arts and investigate the effectiveness of proximal choking interventions in music, dance, and acting performance. So we propose that 3 interventions can be practically implemented by performing artists: a pre-performance routine, the so-called left-hand dynamic hand grip as a specific pre-performance routine element, and goal setting. And these interventions may also increase performers' feelings of control prior to performing, and thus enhance self-efficacy, which is a strong predictor of performance quality. A pre-performance routine is a set of cognitive and behavioral elements, such as the systematic use of specific keywords and imagery or deep abdominal breathing. And I'd like to emphasize its systematic use in the minutes leading up to the performance. So engaging in such a routine has been shown to be very effective for athletes. It is designed to prevent distraction and improve concentration by reducing negative introspection, lowering anxiety levels, and increasing attention on the performance task. It may therefore also improve self-efficacy by influencing one's interpretations of anxiety. And then the left-hand dynamic hand grip involves squeezing a soft ball like this one, like I'm showing you now, in the left hand twice per second for about 30 seconds. And this increases cortical activity and triggers an inhibition response in the brain, which then induces cortical relaxation and prevents interference from irrelevant brain regions. So it is therefore an intervention designed to prevent explicit monitoring, and it has been shown to have large effects on performance quality in high pressure situations across different disciplines and sports, such as badminton, gymnastics, and soccer. As you can see, it is a relatively easily implementable intervention that would also be suitable for performing artists. Now, goal setting refers to an action plan to guide a performer toward a specific goal. This should help to focus on task-relevant aspects and improve concentration, and should also translate to the attentional control needed to perform under pressure. So my dissertation is planned to include 4 studies for investigating the following specific objectives. First, to provide an overview of existing performance enhancement interventions in the performing arts. This includes not only strategies to manage performance anxiety, but also psychological interventions for the support of the self-regulated learning performer. And second, to test the effectiveness of pre-performance routine, left-hand dynamic hand grip, and goal setting in promoting performance under pressure in the performing arts. So we had 2 experimental studies planned to investigate the effects in general, and a mixed methods follow-up study with choking susceptible performers in particular. And this 4th study is also aimed at the practical application in realistic settings to inspire future studies. So for this first study, the systematic review, we applied the PRISMA methodology and we searched across different databases. And the main outcomes were the intervention's relative impact, the time and frequency of implementation, the underlying theoretical model, and performance mediating variables. And studies were eligible if they included a psychological, that is non-pharmacologic intervention to enhance performance in stage acting, music, or ballet, contemporary, or ballroom dance. And the studies had to include a performance task that was relevant to the respective domain. It should have expert evaluations, participant self-evaluations, or objective measures. So particularly in dance, that would be kinetic or kinematic analysis, or there would be in music, for example, statistical analysis of MIDI recordings. The studies had to include skilled individuals or trained novices and had to have a pre-test, post-test, or multiple baseline design. And it was important that there were also quantitative measurements of the performance outcome. This resulted in 5,023 records, quite a lot. Also, we found 36 additional records, and in the end, we selected 90 articles with 96 studies. And as psychological interventions to enhance performance are ultimately aimed at improving self-regulation, Zimmerman's self-regulated learning theory provides a suitable theoretical framework. Seeing the development of one's ability to perform well through the lens of a continuous process of learning and improvement, we propose a categorization of psychological interventions for performance enhancement according to the cyclical model of self-regulated learning, namely into the 3 reciprocal phases of forethought, performance, and self-reflection, as you can see here in this graph. And forethought precedes performance and should enhance it. And psychological skills are applied in the performance phase and are intended to improve the action itself as well as self-monitoring during this action. And self-reflection processes occur after the performance and should optimize a person's reactions to their achieved outcomes. So psychological interventions can thus be aimed at optimizing task analysis and self-motivation beliefs during preparation, reaching an optimal physical and mental state immediately before and during the performance on stage, or enhancing the artist's self-judgment, self-reaction, and perception of progress. And in green color, you can see all the different interventions that are included in the systematic review. So the results are currently in preparation. And in our own empirical work on sports psychological interventions for performing artists, we focus on supporting the forethought and performance phases. So I'd like to give you an insight here. In our experimental studies with musicians, we aimed to apply 3 interventions from sports to optimize musicians' performance and self-efficacy under pressure. And we also wanted to address methodological issues and include a control group, a high pressure condition, and expert evaluations of performance quality. Using a pre-performance routine can optimize performance for all skill levels in general and under pressure in particular. Now, we first conducted a pilot study, and here we assumed that goal setting would be less effective than the pre-performance routine. And we hypothesized that participants using a pre-performance routine will perform better and have higher self-efficacy under pressure than participants using goal setting. So here, goal setting had been intended to be a neutral intervention for a control group, as we had designed it for structuring daily music practice rather than focusing attention before performance. And in our main study, we then also included a waitlist control group without an intervention. And we hypothesized that participants applying a pre-performance routine, the dynamic hand grip, or goal setting would perform better and have higher self-efficacy under pressure than the control group. And because high trade performance anxiety is in general likely to amplify the performance harming effect of pressure, the interventions might be especially helpful for performers high in trade performance anxiety. So in the pilot study, we had 30 violin performance students, and in the main study, study 2, we had 46 aspiring professional violinists and violists perform audition excerpts under low and high pressure. So we focused on just these instruments because it has been shown before that if you mix instruments, there will be a bias in the performance evaluation. And while the pilot study could take place on site, study 2 had to be conducted online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So pressure in the post-test was induced through mock auditions in the presence of an expert jury who gave individual feedback to each participant after their performance. And in the main study, this mock audition took place with a live performance on Zoom for an expert jury, so that was quite a challenge. And in the month between performances, the randomly assigned groups in the pilot study applied either a pre-performance routine or goal setting to their daily practice, and the randomly assigned groups in study 2 practiced a pre-performance routine, dynamic hand grip or goal setting, while the waitlist control group practiced without an intervention. So I explained the respective intervention strategies to each participant individually in one-on-one sessions. In study 2, this would also take place via Zoom. And the pre-performance routines were based on the centering technique, but in some cases adapted to specific needs of the participants. So generally, centering includes finding a focus point in the room, deep abdominal breathing, focusing on one's center of gravity in the body, releasing excessive muscle tension, and thinking about keywords or imagery. And for both studies, the compliance was checked with a simple protocol in the form of daily text messages. So I just asked participants whether they had practiced their routine or set goals for their practice on the respective day. And the dependent variables were performance quality and self-efficacy. And the performance quality was evaluated by the participants themselves, by psychology students representing a lay audience, and by a fully blinded expert jury. The results for both of these studies showed that participants perceived the interventions as equally helpful, but there were no significant differences in self-expert and audience evaluations of performance quality between intervention and control groups. And in the pilot study, we found that participants in both groups evaluated their performance higher after the intervention, whereas expert jurors evaluated worse. So this is quite an interesting finding. However, we found that participants using a pre-performance routine reported a higher self-efficacy in the post-test than those using goal setting. And yeah, the scale on the self-efficacy for musical performance questionnaire is from 1 to 7. So in the second study, all groups reported higher self-efficacy in the post-test. And here, trait performance anxiety had a moderating effect on self-efficacy. So especially intervention participants high in trait anxiety increased their self-efficacy. That's what you can see on the right side of this graph. So in the pilot study, self and jury evaluations diverged from one another. Compared to jury evaluations, participants overestimated the quality of their performance. And when comparing pre-performance routines and goal setting, participants in the pre-performance routine group reported higher self-efficacy, indicating that they were more confident in their playing and their ability to give a successful performance than those who learned goal setting. And in study 2, the use of the interventions resulted in higher self-efficacy, but only in participants high in trait music performance anxiety, without having an effect on performance quality. So the interventions may be beneficially applied to everyday practice to increase the self-efficacy of performers who suffer from this. However, more research is needed on how to adjust the interventions to also ensure performance-related benefits. Now, study 3 was supposed to be a conceptually replication of study 2 with dancers, but this unfortunately has not yet been possible due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we really hope that maybe we can do that next year. But we were able to conduct study 4, the follow-up case study. And with this, we took a step back and intended to answer the questions: what challenges do performing artists with high performance anxiety face? How can solution-focused coaching address these? And how can interventions for performance under pressure be tailored to their needs? And the artists defined themselves what their goal was for the whole coaching process, as well as for each of the 5 coaching sessions. So I did not interfere with their goals. And we selected 10 performing arts students who identified themselves as significantly affected by performance anxiety and who also scored high in measures of trait performance anxiety and fear of negative evaluation and low in self-efficacy. So 1 actress, 2 dancers, and 7 musicians participated in the study. The 10 artists received 5 coaching sessions, including tailored interventions for performance under pressure. And before and after the intervention phase, they filled in the questionnaires, they performed a stress test and an audition task in front of a jury, and they were then interviewed about their experience. And transcripts of interviews and coaching sessions were analyzed using thematic analysis. In addition to their individual real-life performances, the artists also recorded a performance video each week to test the application of their respective interventions. So as you can see, we collected a lot of data during the study, which provided a rich picture of the individual as well as the pandemic-related challenges that performing artists with high performance anxiety are facing in their artistic everyday life. But as the analysis of the coaching sessions and interviews has not yet been completed for all participants, I will focus on exemplary cases to illustrate in more detail what the study was about. And I would first like to show you how we measured the participants' heart rate, both in the pre-test and in the post-test. So you can see the charts of heart rate measurements of 9 participants. We used a biofeedback smartwatch. Unfortunately, the post-test measurements of Eva, the cellist, was not completely recorded, so therefore her chart is not included. And the pre-test is shown in blue and the post-test is shown in green. Now, as you can see, the heart rate of Bianca, the trumpet player, that's on the top row in the middle, and Zoe, the jazz singer, remained stable between pre and post-test. And you might also notice how Zoe's heart rate is actually much lower than the others. So we assume that that's the case because she might be breathing differently for her singing, probably involving more of the whole body. And the heart rate of Julia, the accordion player, was 26% higher in the post-test. And in the interview, she acknowledged that she was a bit nervous, but she evaluated that in a positive way. So she mentioned that as it was the last week of the semester, she had been quite tired when she arrived, so she was glad about the nervousness because it made her more awake. And as you can see, she also already began with a much higher baseline in the post-test. So this was quite interesting, quite diverse. The heart rate of the other participants decreased in the post-test. And even though this physiological measure is regarded as a valid indicator of performance anxiety, an increased heart rate does not necessarily have to lead to a negative cognitive or emotional reaction, as Julia's example showed. I will now present you the results of the questionnaire data. So the tables show the sum scores for each participant pre and post-test, as well as their percentile ranks in relation to the norm scores of a representative sample. And in trait performance anxiety, Lucy, the actress, actually started with a relatively low score. So her score increased in the post-test, but everyone else reduced their anxiety scores mostly to an average or even below average level. So for example, Bianca, the classical trumpet player, dropped from a percentile rank of 96 down to 24. So that was a very impressive development. And green color means a drop below average, blue means average, and yellow means a drop that is still above the norm. And all participants decreased their scores in fear of negative evaluation. And also here, Lucy, the actress, exhibited a strong improvement. And in terms of self-efficacy, she started with a rather high percentile rank, so she experienced a slight drop, but everyone else was also able to increase their self-efficacy after the intervention period. So I would now like to go into details about the coaching processes with Lucy, with Bianca, and with Coco. That was one of the contemporary dancers. So Lucy's overall goal for the coaching process was to let go of thoughts and the desire to control and focus more on the present moment. And in her first session, she wanted to work on her inner attitude and goal orientation. So she wanted to let go of her fear to send, her fear to communicate with the audience. And generally, her language was so full of metaphors and images that I was prompted to use imagery in every session. In this first session, she established an image of being invincible and being like a tree. And we also worked on her pre-performance routine. And then in the second session, she wanted to talk about self-care after emotionally challenging performances. So she had to perform a monologue that was closely connected to her personal life because she had experienced breaking up with her partner, and this monologue was about being jealous and being furious and being very emotional. So she needed a tool to make her feel safe after the performance. And we used a lot of imagery and also an imaginary journey to a safe place. So something that she could then, after the performance, always return to. And in the third session, we talked about managing emotional transitions during performance. So for her bachelor's recital, she had a kind of medley, so like a mix of different elements of musical and monologues, but also singing, also classical songs. And this was a very rapid change between these different elements. So we worked a lot with fluency and color cues for each of these elements that would make it easier for her to go from one to the next. And she then successfully applied that in her bachelor's show. And then after that, in the fourth session, we talked about breaking the fourth wall. So kind of having more of this connection with the audience and how to be authentic when you record yourself for an audition, for example. And again, here imagery was the tool of choice. And in the last session, we did a process reflection and talked about future intentions We appreciated her strengths and resources and also her past successes, and revisited the intervention strategies of the past sessions. With Bianca, her goal for the whole process was a more self-confidence as part of a positive development. So she, in my experience, was the one who suffered the most from her anxiety. She also cried a lot in the sessions, but for her it was very important to stress that she was just on a long journey towards a positive development. And in her first session, she intended to have fewer negative thoughts. So we did self-talk and cognitive restructuring, and we also talked about her pre-performance routine and the concept of acclimatization training. So this is something from sports psychology, where you train under mild anxiety so that it prepares you for the pressure situation. And in the second session, she just wanted to have a good feeling and motivation for an upcoming important audition. And I also showed her the left-hand dynamic hand grip, and we established positive affirmations for her. Now that audition went really well for her, she won it. And in her third session, it was then more about getting a perspective of what's happening next. And so I actually just wanted to introduce goal setting to her, but she established a much more long-term perspective of how she wanted to be a positive human being. So this was not just about her identity as a musician, it was also really a very broad perspective of who she wanted to be as a human being. And in the fourth session, she then had a lot of requests to step in for concerts rather short notice, so she wanted some strategies to deal with everyday stress. So I did some classical relaxation strategies with her, like progressive muscle relaxation and autogenic training, and also reminded her of her resources that she could use here. And also, just like with Lucy as well, I did process reflection in the last session. And then with Coco, the contemporary dancer, her overall goal was to optimize her mental performance preparation. And in the first session, we worked on finding mental focus, embodiment, and calmness for the backstage moment by developing her pre-performance routine. And in the second session, she wished to reflect about her routine for the day before and the day of the performance. So we structured and adapted her warm-up, her schedule, rehearsal strategy, and also the amount of interpersonal interactions according to repertoire and kind of performance. And to help her relax and sleep better on the day before, I introduced her to autogenic training. To improve her imagery skills for mental practice, we talked about relaxation before imagery, as well as specific imagery exercises. And in the third session, Coco was focused on the particularities of performing for a camera and recording herself for auditions. So as you can see, that's also parallel with Lucy, the actress, and that's something very special that artists had to consider, especially during the pandemic. So here we worked on mastery imagery and self-talk. And in the fourth session, she was keen to find ways to prepare for unprepared or unexpected circumstances in auditions. So I introduced the concept of acclimatization training to her, which means to practice under conditions creating mild anxiety. And we also discussed planned disruptions. And that means that you integrate subjective stressors into your training. So this is also something from sports psychology. And we also talked about where Coco could direct her gaze to during an audition. And again, in the last session, we reflected about her strengths and resources and talked through the intervention strategies again. So as you could see, I worked with all three of these artists on their pre-performance routine. Interestingly, all three of them prefer to call it their checklist. And so you can see there are always elements of what they prefer to do backstage, and then elements that they like to use immediately before the performance or directly on stage. So for Lucy, this meant to first make sure that her costume, hair, and makeup were in order, and then to go through the text one more time if she felt that was necessary. Then check that her voice was there, that it was present, and mentally go through directions of the director one more time, or maybe even the choreographer or voice coach. And immediately before going on stage, she would do centering, she would do breathing, abdominal breathing, and she would think about her intentions for the performance. So this is also kind of goal setting and also thinking about the effect she would like to have with her performance. And then she would go into the basic emotion of the piece that she was playing and think about, okay, what happens before my figure appears? So which emotion am I in here? Why is that happening? And then finding a trigger for this beginning emotion. This helped her a lot. So even just the next session after we discussed this, she just had actually a singing performance, and she said that she could really like notice the difference and kind of the amount of safety and certainty it gave her to have this kind of checklist. And for Bianca, it was more like classic centering routine. But she would start backstage with breathing exercises, usually for 5 minutes, and holding every inhale and exhale for about 5 seconds. And then she'd do a warm-up, and she'd think about having a good posture, finding her center, finding a focus point in the room, doing some deep breathing, thinking about calming imagery. So for her, that was kind of the image of calm creek in the woods, so nature would always calm her down. And she'd think about positive affirmations such as, I am good, I can play well, I am enough. And she'd look at her focus point again and just give her dress, her hair, one more last check and make sure that she had all her instruments and sheet music with her, and go on stage. And on stage, she would just do the same thing again, just in a very compressed, condensed version. And she also reported that this was very helpful to her. And now Coco had some routines for backstage, like the 30 minutes before the performance. She likes to release stress by dancing freestyle to pop music, unrelated to the piece being performed. And if necessary, she would then listen to musically challenging parts. And she'd actively avoid watching other dancers marking the whole choreography in front of her, as this makes her uncomfortable. And when possible, she would hold hands with other dancers backstage, which would give her energy and a feeling of connectedness. And then immediately before the performance, she would use abdominal breathing and focus on her center of gravity. And then she'd imagine the space around her and visualize moments with other dancers and imagine herself executing a challenging movement in the best way possible. So she'd use mastery imagery. And she would then feel the mood of the piece and think about words she associates with it. And then she would direct her energy towards a focus point on the floor. And if performing a part with someone else, she would then establish eye contact with that person. And finally, she would count before starting to dance in order to be on time. So I would like to conclude with some closing remarks from these 3 artists. So Bianca said what she learned about herself, what she learned during the study, was that above all, being nervous is something that is somehow accompanying almost every musician. And it's not something that one takes care of within 2 weeks. And the most important thing is just to learn how to deal with it. And she took away definitely a bit of all the methods and all the resources, all the tools, so that I simply have a few things on hand that help me. And what I can consistently use and remind myself of when I just feel like I need it. So simply some strategies, maybe. And Lucy said what she learned was that it's not as bad as one often imagines. So because the panic or the anxiety or the worry do not come from the outside, but one creates it oneself. Nothing can happen to you, because even if I perform a monologue like just now, which then somehow kills me, I can take my time and it doesn't have to have anything to do with me. I can always return to the beautiful place and know that my life is all right. So I would say I learned a certain calmness. I learned techniques that help me. And I've noticed how much creativity can happen when I'm calm, when I'm not demanding too much. And at the same time, I haven't lost any strength or anything. So I have the feeling that strength comes through relaxation. Creativity comes through relaxation. And then the good thoughts will also come in the very moment where they are supposed to come. And I do feel that my performance has since increased. Through this very calmness, I feel I've become more permeable, just more relaxed through the checklist. And more permeable in the sense that when I now think about the voice recital, that in that moment, I really tried to integrate this versatility into every sentence, into every note. That was only possible to happen because I'm so at ease and because I just knew what I want. And Coco remarked, what I took away is a lot of self-reflection and some strategies that I can implement into my performance. And yes, some motivation as well. I felt it was also really nice to do it, and a kind of a checkpoint of many factors of performance that maybe I think about that I'm like, oh gosh, this is stressful, and that's how it is. Okay, but what is stressful about it, or how can you remove that stress? And what do you need to do to then feel better about it? Or that also how to deal with these situations when they happen. I feel like I would be really kind of prepared if something really bad happened. And then very bad situation, I'd be like, okay, steps. Like also this kind of checklist of, okay, how do I deal with this right now? And I work a lot with this type of stuff. So not to look for perfection or stability in every area, that I'm prepared for everything, but also if I'm not prepared to something, that I can deal with it, that I can optimize my preparation on my hand, but also be ready to adjust. So this was kind of what I think we want to achieve with our intervention research. And these examples show that pre-performance routines can be very individual. They probably need some time and need to be embedded into a more long-term program. But as you can see, this research is also very different from the experimental work that I showed you at the beginning. And I am convinced that this more mixed methods and qualitative approach will gain a lot of valuable insight into this field of research. So now I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments, and I thank you very much for listening.